What happens when the most feared man in the company is publicly called arrogant, entitled, and emotionally blind by the one person he never truly saw? Claire Donovan was just a secretary, or at least, that's what everyone thought. But behind her quiet presence was a woman who had once been a writer, a daughter holding her mother's hand through illness, and someone who had long since given up on being seen. When she stood up and challenged her millionaire boss in front of the entire boardroom, no one expected what came next. Not a firing, not an apology, but a proposition that would change them both forever. Why did a powerful CEO suddenly ask his assistant to teach him how to be human? What secret was hidden in a sculpture he never showed anyone? And how can two broken people who never asked to be saved end up healing each other without ever saying the word love? This is not just a story of confrontation, it's a story of becoming. If this touched something in you, already don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Let's begin. She didn't plan to say it out loud, but when Claire stood in that mahogany-walled boardroom, watching her boss throw her under the bus again, the words exploded from her chest before she could stop them. You are arrogant, entitled, and emotionally blind. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the overhead lights. No one moved, no one breathed. 20 pairs of eyes widened across the long, polished table, and even the assistant from finance froze mid-sip, her coffee trembling in hand. Claire Donovan didn't flinch. Not anymore. She had flinched enough through 3 years of standing behind this man, correcting his scheduling errors, rewording his tone-deaf memos, smoothing the jagged edges he left behind in every room he exited. But today, she had reached her limit. The morning had started like any other in the high-rise offices of Caldwell Properties. The windows gleamed, the marble floors clicked under the heels of the elite, and Claire had arrived early, as she always did, her notes organized, her breath steady. The boardroom was set, coffee poured just right, the agenda finalized. But when Graham Caldwell walked in late, unread documents in hand, tie slightly crooked, it wasn't his tardiness that ignited her. It was what came after. He sat at the head of the table with the ease of someone used to control. Power looked good on him. Claire had to admit gray suit pressed to perfection. Dark hair graying just enough to be distinguished. Not old, but power had made him careless, arrogant. The quarterly report had one figure off. A minor oversight, perhaps. But when the room noticed, when Mr. Granger arched a brow and asked who had reviewed it, Graham didn't hesitate. Ms. Donovan handled that section, he said, flipping the page as if he hadn't just thrown her under a train. Her fingers curled around the pen in her lap. It had been his last-minute changes penciled in after hours, scribbled over the finalized version, then pushed back to her desk with a post-it that simply read, "Send." She had. And now, here they were. Claire stood before she realized she'd moved. Her chair scraped the floor in a long, low wail that seemed to echo her own rising heat. You are arrogant, she said, voice steadier than her racing heart, entitled and emotionally blind. It wasn't a scream. It was worse, it was truth, spoken aloud in a place where truth was always whispered behind closed doors. Across the table, Lydia, fresh-faced and only 3 months into the job, clutched her notepad like a life vest. Mr. Granger blinked, slowly, as though he couldn't quite process what had just happened. Someone coughed, quietly, hoping it would puncture the silence. Graham didn't move. He looked at Claire, eyes unreadable, jaw set not in anger, but in something closer to contemplation. The air in the room was heavy, waiting for the inevitable storm. Claire waited too. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. Her breath felt too loud, her body too still. She braced for it, the dismissal, the condescension, the cold, cutting line he was so skilled at delivering with that sharp, perfect voice of his. But then he did something she didn't expect. He leaned back, just slightly, just enough for the chair to creak beneath him. Then he let out a breath not sharp, not weary, just human. Everyone else, he said, voice calm as winter. Please leave. The room didn't move. Now, he added, not louder, but with finality. Chairs shifted, papers rustled. There was a collective moment of side glances and silent questions, but no one dared to linger, not after the way he'd said now. Claire didn't sit. She didn't blink. She stared straight ahead, watching the last member of the board file out. The glass door clicked shut behind them with a soft, almost apologetic thud. And then it was just the two of them. Graham, Claire. The quiet hum of tension between them. She didn't speak. Not yet. She watched him. Watched the way he ran a thumb along the edge of his water glass. The way he avoided her gaze. The way he looked less like a man ready to punish, and more like someone measuring what had just been said against something deeper inside. Her throat tightened. Maybe she'd gone too far. Maybe she had finally burned the last bridge. But somewhere beneath the fear, there was something else. A flicker, not relief, not pride, just something clean, raw, honest. Because for the first time in a very long time, Claire Donovan had said what she meant, and she wasn't sorry. The silence stretched, delicate and unbroken. Claire's pulse still thundered in her ears as she stood beside the high-backed chair, her fingers still lightly touching the polished wood. She thought about her apartment back in Evanston, the stack of unopened rejection letters from publishers in her drawer, her mother's soft voice on the phone that morning. Don't stay quiet when something inside you wants to be heard. And here she was. The door was closed. The room was still. And Claire Donovan waited. Most people at Caldwell only knew Claire as the woman behind the coffee orders and calendar invites. The one who remembered birthdays no one else did, who left neatly folded agendas in leather binders before every Monday meeting, who carried 2 phones but rarely raised her voice. They knew her by her calmness, her quiet competence. But very few ever asked what brought a once promising novelist to a corporate high-rise in downtown Chicago, and even fewer knew what it cost her to stay. Claire Donovan hadn't always lived this life of routines and silence. Once, there had been pages whole worlds she wrote into existence on second-hand laptops in tiny cafes, her fingers stained with ink, her mind filled with possibilities. There were notebooks stacked in boxes under her bed, still smelling faintly of coffee grounds and ambition. She'd had an agent once, a deal almost signed, but life had an uncanny way of shifting under you just as your feet found steady ground. Her marriage was the first thing to go quietly, like a door closing in a distant room. It wasn't explosive. It was the kind of unraveling that starts with long silences and ends with shared furniture being divided like courtroom evidence. He wanted clarity. She wanted space to write. He found someone else. She found eviction notices tucked into her mailbox. Then came her mother's diagnosis, congestive heart failure. A quiet word from a doctor in a white coat that hit like a bomb in a church pew. And just like that, Claire packed up her manuscripts and moved back to Evanston, into the old 2-bedroom apartment she thought she'd left behind for good. The place smelled like lavender and old wood. The carpet curled at the corners, but her mother's smile soft. Resilient made it home again. Money grew tighter. Books didn't sell. Freelance gigs disappeared in the flood of younger, faster writers willing to do more for less. She took the Caldwell interview on a whim, a listing she saw while waiting at St. Mary's Heart Center during one of her mother's echo scans. She wore a blazer borrowed from a cousin and sat on her trembling hands while waiting to be called. The interview lasted 9 minutes. Graham Caldwell didn't look up once from his tablet. He asked 3 questions, didn't smile once. At the end, he simply said, "You start Monday." Claire left the glass building with a storm of mixed emotions, relief, shame, something that might have been gratitude, and a little voice whispering, "You're not supposed to be here. This isn't the life you wrote for yourself." But rent was due, and her mother's pills cost more than they used to. So Claire put her pen in a drawer, tied her hair back, and learned how to read the moods of a man who never spoke more than 12 words in a room. 3 years passed. She became fluent in his silences, learned that, when Graham paused too long before replying, he wasn't thinking he was restraining, that he hated small talk, loved black coffee, and only read emails sent before 6 a.m. She covered his mistakes, rewrote his memos, scheduled his meetings around his moods, not his availability. She sent flowers to grieving employees under his name, drafted personal thank you notes he never saw, ensured birthdays were acknowledged because somewhere deep down, she believed that someone should be human in that place. No one ever asked about the cost, and Claire never offered, until yesterday, when her words raw, unfiltered rose from a place buried so deep inside her she hardly recognized the voice. Now, the morning after. Claire sat in her kitchen, staring at the worn wooden table, a bowl of oatmeal growing cold in front of her. The radio played softly in the background, a host talking about spring storms moving in from the west. Rain again, across the room. Her mother sat at the window, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching cardinals gather at the feeder Claire had refilled before dawn. "You didn't sleep," her mother said gently. Claire shook her head, sipping lukewarm coffee. Her stomach turned at the thought of going into the office, at seeing him, at being seen, because now she wasn't just the calendar woman. She was the woman who spoke, the one who broke the rules. And though part of her felt exposed, stripped bare, and foolish, another part, a small, forgotten spark, felt something she hadn't felt in years. Free. "Do you regret it?" her mother asked without turning. Claire didn't answer right away. She thought of Graham's face after the outburst. Not angry, not amused, just quiet. Like he'd finally heard something that pierced the fog. "I don't know," she whispered, but in her heart, the answer was already taking shape. Later that morning, she packed a small lunch for her mother: chicken salad, fruit slices, a tiny container of lemon pudding, and wrote a note to remind the nurse about the 2P medication. Her bag was lighter than usual. She didn't bring the company laptop, just her notepad, a pen, and a printed copy of her resignation letter, folded neatly in her coat pocket. On the train ride in, she stared at the skyline. The city looked gray, reflective, like it was watching her back. She thought of the first time she walked through the revolving doors at Caldwell, shoulders squared, mouth tight, heart clenching with guilt. And she thought of Graham, of the way he'd looked at her after everyone left the room, not with rage, not with pity, but with something closer to respect, or maybe recognition. She remembered her first week on the job, when she'd brought him a coffee with a note decaf in the afternoons. "Per your blood pressure notes." He never said thank you, but the next day, he drank it anyway. That was their rhythm, wordless, efficient, distant, but maybe he had heard more than she thought. As the train pulled into the station, Claire closed her eyes for a moment. Her hands, always steady, trembled slightly as she stood. She wasn't sure if it was fear or clarity, but either way, she walked forward, toward the building, toward whatever would come next. And as she stepped through the glass doors of Caldwell Properties once again, resignation letter still in her pocket, she realized something she hadn't dared admit out loud. A part of her didn't want to leave. Not yet. Not before she found out what happened when the truth finally landed. Claire expected a pink slip. Instead, he handed her a contract. The elevator ride up to the 48th floor felt longer than usual, not because of the mechanical hum or the ever-so-slight creak of cables, but because she knew this was it, the end. No one stood up to Graham Caldwell in a boardroom and kept their job. She had reread her resignation letter 3 times the night before, tweaking phrases, softening edges, but now it was irrelevant. This wouldn't be a graceful exit. It would be one of those abrupt, no eye contact terminations where someone from HR stood nearby with a box. Still, she had shown up, no makeup, no armor. Just a pressed navy blouse and the calm determination of a woman who had nothing left to lose. His assistant wasn't at her desk. Strange. The hallway outside his office stretched long and sterile, each step echoing in her ears. As she approached the frosted glass doors, she caught her reflection, tired eyes, lips pressed together, hands clenched around the strap of her worn leather bag. The door was already ajar. She pushed it gently. Graham stood by the window, his back to her. The morning light poured in, framing him like a silhouette carved from stone. He didn't turn. "Close the door," he said. Claire obeyed. Silence sat between them for a few beats. The kind of silence that didn't fill space, it strained it, made the air heavier. Then he turned, slowly. In his hand was a folder, not her personnel file, not the pink slip she'd expected, a contract. He held it out to her across the room, like it weighed nothing, but her feet didn't move. "What is this?" she asked, her voice low, unsure. "A counteroffer," he said simply. She blinked. "To firing me." He didn't smile. "To losing you." Her eyes narrowed. She stepped forward cautiously, like someone approaching an animal that might bite. She took the folder, flipped it open and froze. Her salary quadrupled. New title, human integration consultant. A clause giving her direct access to executive decisions. No NDA about internal memos. No gag order. Full agency. "You can't be serious," she said. "I am." Claire laughed once, short and bitter. "So, what? You want to pay me 4 times my salary to, what? Teach you how not to be a sociopath." He didn't flinch. "Something like that. I'm not a therapist. I didn't ask for one." "Then what are you asking for?" He paused. Honesty, unfiltered, repeatedly, consistently, loudly, if needed. Claire stared at him, stunned. This had to be a joke. But Graham Caldwell didn't do jokes. He walked to his desk, leaned his hip against it. "Yesterday, you said I was arrogant, entitled, and emotionally blind. I remember. I agree." She blinked. "You what I agree," he repeated, "and I can't afford to be anymore." Claire crossed her arms. "Why me?" He looked at her then. Truly looked, for the first time in a long while. "Because you're the only one who's ever told me the truth, and I didn't fire you for it. Yet. I'm not going to." She sat in the leather chair across from him without realizing it. Her hands trembled slightly as they gripped the folder. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. "You don't change people like this." "Graham," she said quietly, "not with contracts, not with raises." He nodded. "I know. I don't believe in change. Claire, not really." "Then why do this?" He looked out the window again. "Because I want to see what happens if I let someone in who's not afraid of me." Those words landed heavier than she expected. Still, Claire's breath caught in her chest, her instinct screaming no. She stood abruptly, folder still in hand. "You're trying to buy your way out of growth. You think money is a shortcut to humanity. That's not how this works." "I don't know how this works," he said plainly. "That's the problem. You do." She took 2 steps toward the door. "Claire," he said, his voice lower now. She stopped but didn't turn. "I'm not asking you to fix me. I'm asking you to hold up a mirror and not look away." Something in her cracked at that, but she left. She didn't slam the door. She didn't drop the folder. She walked out like someone retreating from the edge of a cliff they weren't ready to jump from. The rest of the day passed in fragments: commuter noise, grocery lines, the soft beep of her mother's heart monitor. Claire made soup, read an old article about heart-friendly diets, and tried not to think about what had happened. But the folder sat on her kitchen table like an unanswered question. And then, just before sunset, a nurse entered her mother's hospital room with a bouquet. Pale yellow roses. Claire's mother's favorite. There was a small card, handwritten in blocky, precise letters, for Helen, from someone who forgot his own mother's smile. Claire's hands went cold. He hadn't signed it. He didn't have to. She stared at the vase, heart tangled in a dozen threads of memory and meaning. Graham had never asked about her mother, never mentioned the heart condition, never pried. But he'd remembered something, maybe a passing line in a meeting, or the way Claire always scheduled doctor visits with religious precision. And he had sent roses, not out of obligation, not for show, but as an apology no one else would ever see. Later that night, Claire sat at her small dining table, legs tucked under her in pajama pants, hair pulled up in a tired knot. The contract lay beside the vase, its edges curling slightly under the weight of her coffee mug. She read it again, slowly this time. The terms were real, the offer generous, but it wasn't the money that kept her from throwing it away. It was the line he'd said, barely above a whisper. I want to see what happens if I let someone in who's not afraid of me. She thought of all the rooms she had entered where she made herself small, all the words she swallowed because they wouldn't matter anyway, all the times she hid behind competence because showing emotion was considered weak. But yesterday, she hadn't hidden. And today, he'd opened a door, not one with keys or locks, one inside himself. She didn't know if he meant it. She didn't know if he'd follow through. She didn't even know if she wanted to be the one to find out. But as she reached for the roses to change their water, her fingers brushed the card again. And a single sentence echoed louder than the rest, from someone who forgot his own mother's smile. It wasn't a confession. It was a scar. And scars, Claire knew, were where the light gets in. If Claire thought her new job was to hand him polite suggestions and HR brochures, she was wrong. Graham had other ideas. He called it her observational residency. She called it weird. On Monday morning, he sent a calendar invite with no description, the location, everywhere I go. Claire showed up wearing her usual work attire, a navy sweater over a white button-down and gray slacks, notebook in hand, a pen she trusted more than most people. She half expected to be ignored, as she had been so many times before. But Graham held the elevator for her that morning. Didn't say anything, just held it. That alone unsettled her more than she cared to admit. At 9:00 a.m., they stepped into the first meeting quarterly budget review with the finance team. Normally, Claire wouldn't have attended. She'd have prepped the binders, arranged the coffee, then disappeared. But now, she sat 2 chairs away from him, silent, scribbling notes not about the numbers, but about him, his tone, his expressions, his body language. It was like watching someone play a role they didn't believe in. When a junior analyst nervously questioned a proposed cut, Graham leaned back and said, "Then you should have spoken sooner." His voice wasn't harsh, but it landed like ice water. Claire wrote tone sharp, defensive, eyes distant, response shut down. Then, below that, maybe ask, what would you have done differently? Instead, by Wednesday, she'd designed a full interpersonal feedback scorecard. She gave him a 3.2 out of 10 on empathy delivery. He read it without flinching. This part, he said, pointing to the emotional availability column, is absurd. I'm not a product. Correct. Claire replied. You're a human. That's the point. He didn't argue, which, for Graham, was progress. Most people would have mocked her spreadsheet, but he studied it like a legal contract. Then, to her surprise, he began referencing it mid-meeting. Once, during a call with the operations director, he paused, looked at Claire, and said flatly, "This is the part where I should probably offer emotional validation, right?" Claire blinked. Yes. He turned back to the screen and said, "I hear your concerns. I understand this feels rushed." There was a beat of silence on the other end, then a stunned, "Thank you." Afterward, Claire gave him a 5.1, still failing, but improving. By Thursday, they had developed a rhythm. She followed him from meeting to meeting, sometimes in silence, sometimes offering short debriefs between elevators. She noticed things no one else had, the way he tapped his thumb when he was about to cut someone off, how he avoided direct eye contact when topics turned emotional, that he often clenched his jaw before dismissing something. And to her surprise, he noticed things too. "You were quieter with marketing today," he said once, out of nowhere. Claire looked up. "What do you mean you didn't interrupt? You always interrupt when you disagree." She raised an eyebrow. "Maybe I'm learning restraint. Or maybe you liked what they said." He walked off before she could respond. It was unsettling, this odd, quiet attention from a man she used to think was emotionally tone-deaf. Now, she wasn't so sure. Then came Friday. She stayed late, catching up on her own emails and prepping a few things for Monday. Most of the office had cleared out by 6, the hum of chatter replaced by distant cleaning crews and the soft buzz of vending machines. Claire had just zipped her laptop into her bag when she realized she'd left her phone charging in the break room 2 floors down. She sighed, stretched her back, and decided to swing by Graham's office to leave a printed copy of her behavioral notes, Week 1. As she approached his office, she noticed the door was cracked open slightly unusual for him. Graham didn't believe in casual accessibility. She paused. Inside, the lights were dimmed, save for the golden glow of a desk lamp. Graham sat not behind his desk, but in the armchair near the window, a sketch pad balanced on his knee. He was hunched forward, elbow resting on the arm of the chair, pencil gliding across the page with startling ease. Claire leaned closer, careful not to make noise. It wasn't a business chart. It wasn't a blueprint. It was a drawing of a hand slightly curled, fingers worn, veins delicately shaded, every line precise, every shadow placed with purpose. Beside it, half finished, was the outline of a woman's face not fully defined, but familiar. Claire's breath caught. She had never seen this side of him. Not even a hint. There were no art pieces in his office, no sketches, no talk of museums or color palettes or form. But here he was, pencil dancing like a second language across the page. Then she noticed something else. Tucked under the sketch pad was a worn portfolio. Black leather, frayed edges. It looked old, reverent. She took a step back. The floor creaked slightly. Graham looked up. He didn't flinch, didn't hide the sketch. He just held her gaze. Neither of them spoke. Claire's heart thudded once hard and fast. He didn't explain, she didn't ask, but in that moment, something shifted. Not dramatically, not romantically, just quietly. The next morning, she found a sticky note left on her desk. In Graham's blocky handwriting, it read, "Don't grade Friday." That one was mine. She smiled, not because it was charming, but because it was real. Later that day, while folding laundry at home, Claire found herself thinking about that sketch, not the details of it, but the softness of his expression when he was drawing. It was the first time she'd seen him look unguarded. Her mother asked her that afternoon, while sipping tea, "How's the new role?" Claire paused, then answered honestly, "It's strange, challenging, confusing. Do you like it? I don't know yet." But the truth was more layered than that. She didn't like it, per se, but she was intrigued, and under all the confusion and resistance, there was a faint pulse of something unexpected. "I haven't been here in 20 years, Graham said, his voice quiet, almost reverent. "I thought I could forget who I was." Claire didn't answer at first. She stood at the threshold of the studio, letting her eyes adjust to the soft, filtered light that seeped through aged skylights above. The air was still, thick with dust and time. It smelled of old plaster, drying clay, and the faintest trace of turpentine like memories sealed in silence. The studio was tucked behind a grove of stubborn trees on the edge of Oak Park. They'd driven in silence most of the way. Graham navigating the narrow roads like a man heading towards something he wasn't sure he wanted to see. He had said nothing about the destination, just that he wanted to show her something. Not for work, he'd added, for something older than that. Now, inside, Claire could feel the weight of that something. The walls were lined with tall, narrow shelves, most of them covered in sheets. Sculpting tools, chisels, rasps. Mallets lay scattered across a long wooden work table, their metal edges dulled by disuse. A cracked stool leaned against the wall. A stone bust, half-finished, stared blankly from the corner. It had no eyes. Claire stepped further in, her heels clicking softly on the concrete floor. She ran her fingers lightly along a shelf, trailing through a thin layer of dust that felt like it had settled there decades ago. "Why bring me here?" she asked gently. Graham stood near the far wall, facing a massive canvas draped in linen. He didn't look back, because you've seen too many versions of me that aren't real. He pulled the linen down in one motion. Underneath was a sculpture not quite complete, but unmistakably alive. Two figures, a child reaching up, a father kneeling, their hands almost touched. I never finished it, he said. Voice, even. I never knew how. Claire stared. The child's expression had been captured mid-hope, mouth slightly parted, eyes searching. But the father's face wasn't fully formed. It faded into texture, suggestion, not identity. She swallowed. It's beautiful. He nodded once. I used to think so. There was something in his posture, not shame exactly, but vulnerability. A kind of nakedness that couldn't be covered with power or money or suits. Claire turned, letting her gaze sweep over the space. In one corner sat a rusted cabinet, its doors ajar, revealing old sketchbooks and rolled-up plans. A dried vine curled near the window. Having grown in through a crack in the frame, the ceiling fan above them wobbled slightly, stirring motes of dust into lazy spirals. I didn't know you were an artist, she said, softer now. I'm not, he replied. I was a student who didn't finish. That's not the same. She turned to face him fully. What happened? He hesitated. Then my father happened. Claire said nothing, only waited. He called it a waste. Graham continued, walking slowly past the sculpture. Said I had 10 fingers and no time for fantasies. When I told him I was applying to RISD, he laughed. Told me if I wanted to starve in New York, sculpting meaningless stones. I could do it without his name, or his money. And you listened? I always did, he said, until I didn't. He picked up a sketch from the table yellowed with age, edges curling, a figure study, a woman, seated, head bowed, arms wrapped around her knees. The lines were light, almost trembling. There was love in every stroke. Claire stepped beside him. She looks like someone you knew. She was, he said, setting the paper down. Once, there was no bitterness in his voice, just memory. Claire moved to the work table and picked up a small figurine, a bird, no larger than her palm, carved from cherry wood. Its wings were extended, just about to lift. She turned it in her hands, marveling at the detail. My aunt, she said suddenly, was a painter. He looked at her. She had depression. For years. Nothing helped. Meds, therapists. Then one day, she started painting watercolors again. Tiny ones postcard-sized. At first, just to pass the time. But it changed her. It gave her something to hold on to. Claire smiled faintly. She said art didn't fix her, but it reminded her she was still here. Graham sat on the edge of the workbench. He looked older in the studio light, not tired, but worn, in a way that made him human. I don't remember the last time I laughed, he said suddenly. The words floated between them, raw and unprotected. Claire met his eyes, laughed, or meant it. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Silence settled again, not heavy this time, but quiet like the kind that happens between two people who no longer need to fill space with noise. She moved toward the back of the studio, where a tall shelving unit held a collection of broken statues and fragments torsos, faces, limbs, some chipped, others unfinished. One had a missing jaw, another, a cracked rib cage. They're not ruined, she said, almost to herself. They're just... Paused. Graham walked beside her, arms folded loosely. I used to think if something broke, it wasn't worth saving. And now I'm trying to remember why I ever thought that. Claire knelt, brushing away dust from a marble bust half buried in a box. It was beautiful, even in its incompleteness. I think things are more beautiful when they carry proof of having survived. Graham didn't speak, but she felt the air shift beside her. Then, as he turned toward another shelf, his elbow bumped a small pedestal. A plaster statue teetered once, twice, then crashed to the ground with a shatter. Claire gasped. Oh no. But when she turned, Graham was looking at the pile of broken plaster with a strange expression. And then, unexpectedly, he laughed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't perfect, but it was real. Claire blinked at him. You laughed, she said. I did, he replied, still chuckling. I forgot how loud it sounds. And suddenly, she was laughing too, not just at the statue or the absurdity of the moment, but at the weight that had just for one breathless second lifted off both their shoulders. When they finally stopped, Claire wiped a tear from her cheek and said, "Guess your emotional availability score just went up." He looked at her, that familiar half-smile returning. "Don't push it." They didn't speak much on the drive back. The silence wasn't awkward, it was thoughtful, full. As they neared the city limits, Claire glanced over at him. The streetlights painted soft streaks across his face, and for the first time since she'd known him, she realized Graham Caldwell was not made of stone. He was made of scars and sketches and stories never told. And maybe, just maybe, he hadn't brought her into his life to teach him how to be human. Maybe he'd brought her there, so they could both remember. They called it strategic restructuring, but Claire knew it for what it really was. A quiet way to say goodbye to hundreds of loyal workers. The boardroom had never felt colder. It wasn't the temperature, it was the way everyone sat with the same rigid posture, nodding at each other in practiced silence, like actors following an invisible script. Polished shoes tapped lightly against the mahogany floors. Coffee steamed, untouched. Eyes avoided confrontation, but not convenience. Claire sat in her usual chair, though it didn't feel like hers anymore. A heavy binder rested in her lap. She hadn't opened it yet. She didn't need to. She already knew what was inside. The proposal had been drafted quietly. A sale of underutilized divisions, they said. An agile downsizing. That word again, strategic. A decision to cut out the limbs of the company in order to save its heart. Except Claire knew those limbs had names, histories, birthdays, pension plans. She had organized retirement parties for some of them, sent condolence flowers to others after spouses passed. She remembered a man named Walter from facilities, who always wore a red tie on Mondays. Another named Evelyn who snuck her Christmas cookies each year, never store-bought, always homemade. 816 employees, gone. If the deal went through, and Graham had signed off in less than 10 minutes. She hadn't seen him that morning. The memo had come from the board itself. Claire was CC'd barely. She read it alone in the kitchenette, her fingers tightening around the mug as the words blurred together on the screen. They'd vote today. She wasn't technically supposed to be there. Her role didn't include executive sessions, but she came anyway. Graham said she was his mirror. Well, today. He could see exactly what he looked like. When Graham finally entered the room, the hum of conversation dimmed. His expression was unreadable, as always. But Claire watched closely, no tapping fingers, no shifting eyes, just that same businesslike stillness that once seemed like strength. Now it felt like absence. The chairman began. As discussed, the restructuring proposal has been reviewed and unanimously recommended by our financial advisors and legal team. Claire didn't hear the rest. Her eyes were fixed on Graham. He wasn't flipping through the packet. He already knew the numbers, knew the outcome. She waited for him to raise a question, to pause, to say something that showed he remembered what it meant to have a conscience. He said nothing. The chairman continued, "So, unless there are any objections, I believe we're ready to move forward with the vote." That's when Claire stood. No one moved, no one expected it. Her voice, when it came, was calm, but it cut like a scalpel. "You're voting to erase 816 lives." Every eye turned. Graham didn't. Claire took a step forward. "That's not a number. It's a history. You're laying off fathers, mothers, people who remember when Caldwell was run from a single floor above a shoe store on Lake Street." The CFO cleared her throat. "Ms. Donovan, with respect, this meeting is—" "I know what it is," Claire said, her voice rising slightly. "It's a rubber stamp for a decision already made. Finally." Graham looked at her. His face was unreadable, but his eyes there was something different. Not cold, not angry, just tired. "Claire," he said evenly, "this isn't your purview." She stared at him. "You made it mine." A beat of silence. Someone shifted awkwardly in a leather chair. The chairman glanced at his watch. Claire held the binder in both hands now, gripping it like a lifeline. Do you remember Sheila from maintenance? She's worked here since she was 19. She has 2 grandkids and takes the bus every day before sunrise. She'll be gone. Another pause. No severance for over 200 of them. She added, That's in the fine print. Did you read it? No response. You told me you wanted someone who wasn't afraid of you. She stepped closer. Well, here I am. Graham's jaw tightened. But he didn't interrupt her. She looked at the others. You all pretend this is about growth, about agility. But what it really is cowardice dressed in a PowerPoint. A low rustle moved through the room. Claire felt her heart hammering in her chest. Her hands trembled, but she didn't lower them. She had never felt more certain and more alone. She looked at Graham one last time, and something inside her broke. Not with anger, with grief. Because she'd started to believe in him. And now, watching him sit there, silent and distant, letting others do the wounding while his hands stayed clean, she realized he might never become the man she hoped he could be. She reached into her bag and pulled out her ID badge. She set it on the table. The sound was quiet, but it echoed like thunder. I won't be part of this, she said. Then she turned and walked out. No one stopped her. No one spoke. The door clicked behind her with a finality that startled even her. Downstairs, the lobby seemed unnaturally bright. She walked past the security desk, past the revolving doors, past the courtyard where the gardener Frank was trimming the bushes, as he had every Thursday morning. He looked up and waved. She waved back. She didn't cry, not yet, but her legs felt heavy with every step, like the air itself was asking her to stay. She didn't. Upstairs, in the empty boardroom, Graham stood alone. The others had cleared out quickly, some offering polite nods, others avoiding his eyes entirely. Only the chairman lingered, offering a bland line about the emotional side of leadership before slipping out the door. Graham hadn't moved. He stood near the far wall, in front of the glass display case that held a miniature model of Caldwell's corporate headquarters, a polished replica in white marble and glass. He stared at it now, one hand lightly resting on the top edge. For years, this had been his compass. Build, scale, optimize. People were unpredictable. Buildings stayed where you put them. But now, he wasn't sure anymore. Claire's words still rang in the air, more honest than anything that had been said around that table in months. He hadn't stopped her. He hadn't fought back. He had just watched her go. And for the first time in a long, long while, Graham Caldwell didn't know if he'd made the right call. The office felt different without her, not quieter, just emptier, like something essential had been unplugged and no one could name what it was. She had left no goodbye note, no farewell lunch, no inbox auto-reply saying she'd moved on to new adventures. Claire Donovan had simply disappeared. And yet, her absence lingered in every hallway, every meeting, every unopened door. It wasn't immediate. The Monday after she walked out, most employees carried on as if the weekend had simply come and gone. But by Tuesday, the undercurrent began to shift. There were the little things. The morning coffee in the executive lounge sat untouched because no one had remembered to switch the filter. The conference agendas arrived 2 minutes late, missing a crucial footnote Claire would never have forgotten. And during a tense investor call, no one interrupted when Graham cut off the CFO mid-sentence, because Claire wasn't there to raise a brow, or slide a note, or whisper, "You're doing it again?" He hadn't told anyone not to contact her. He didn't need to. They sensed it that this silence wasn't negotiable. Even Lydia, her young assistant, had only whispered once, in the copy room. I miss her laugh, before quickly changing the subject. The space Claire once occupied remained untouched. Her desk, cleared but not emptied, held small ghosts, a paperweight shaped like a quill, a half-used notebook, the faint scent of vanilla hand lotion still clinging to the air. Graham walked past it every morning, And every time, he slowed just slightly without realizing it. The board approved the restructuring deal. The layoffs began. Over 800 people. They left in waves, some quietly, some angrily, most with disbelief, trying to make sense of it all. Graham signed the notices with a hand that didn't shake, but his nights told a different story. He stopped sleeping. The penthouse, usually his sanctuary of silence and glass, became a prison of echoing thoughts. He tried sketching again, pulling out the worn portfolio Claire had once glimpsed. But the pencil refused to obey. His fingers hovered over the paper, unsure. The child he'd once drawn, the one reaching up, remained incomplete. The father figure beside him, faceless still. He would sit for hours under the dim light of his kitchen, staring at the sketch pad, waiting for the lines to return. They didn't. On Thursday, he did something no one expected. He went to the company cafeteria. For the first time in 6 years, no bodyguard, no assistant, just him. The room fell into an awkward hush when he entered. Some employees looked up with surprise. Others pretended not to notice. He ordered a turkey sandwich and black coffee, Claire's usual, and scanned the room. He found the corner booth near the windows, the one she always picked. She liked the view. She once said, something about the way the trees swayed in the breeze made her feel like the city hadn't won completely. He sat there, alone, and took one bite of the sandwich. It was bland, but he finished it anyway. He stayed long enough for people to grow uncomfortable. Then he stood, nodded at the janitor sweeping near the vending machines, an older man with kind eyes, and left. He didn't say a word, but word spread anyway. He sat where Claire used to sit. Someone whispered. He ordered her coffee. He looked tired. Back in his office that evening, he stared at the inbox blinking on his screen. Hundreds of unread emails, numbers, contracts, approvals. A new proposal for streamlining the remaining departments. But all he could see was a single line written in her old notebook. Left behind. Efficiency is hollow when it lacks empathy. He didn't remember her writing that, but he believed she had. He read it again, then closed the laptop and walked out. The city was damp that night, not rainy, just gray. Even the streetlights looked dimmer. He found himself driving, though he hadn't planned to. He took the long route through Evanston, passing the library, the flower shop Claire once mentioned. He didn't stop. He drove past her apartment building, but didn't park. He just looked up at the third-floor window where her light used to be on until late. It was dark now, like the rest of him. He returned home to silence. Even his dog, who had passed 2 years ago, felt like a presence now. He imagined the soft scratch of claws against the hardwood, the way the old Labrador used to rest his head on Graham's lap during storms. He had named him August. Claire never knew that. He sat on the edge of his bed and leaned forward, elbows on knees, palms over his eyes. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was punishment. The next day, he showed up at work in a navy sweater instead of a blazer, no tie. He didn't explain why. Meetings came and went. Numbers were thrown across screens. Someone joked about leaning into the disruption. Graham didn't laugh. At lunch, he stared out the 48th floor window, watching the clouds bunch like fists above the lake. His assistant brought in a new report. He didn't open it. By evening, he was back in his office alone. The lights dimmed, sketchbook untouched on the corner of the desk. He ran a hand over its leather cover, fingertips pausing at the worn corner. Then his email pinged. He ignored it. Then it pinged again and again. 3 in a row, all from the same sender, St. Mary's Heart Center. His stomach tightened. He opened the first message, subject emergency admission, Helen Donovan. Time, 7:14 p.m. Dear Mr. Caldwell, you were listed as an emergency contact for Ms. Helen Donovan. She was admitted this evening with acute arrhythmia. Immediate family has not yet been reached. Please call the hospital at your earliest convenience. The second email confirmed her condition had stabilized but required observation. The third had no words, just a scanned consent form for temporary medical decision rights. He stared at the screen. Claire had listed him. Not Lydia, not a neighbor, not a cousin. Him, even after everything, even after she left. She trusted him with her mother. The woman who once said, "You remind me of my late husband, too clever for your own good." Graham rose slowly, grabbing his coat from the hook, heart pounding. He didn't know what he'd say when he got there. He didn't even know if Claire would be in the room, but he knew without question he had to go. And for the first time in weeks, he hoped she'd still want him there. He didn't plan on staying. Just drop the flowers and go. But then he saw her curled on a plastic chair, face in her hands, and something in him broke open. The hallway smelled faintly of antiseptic and warm vinyl. Overhead lights buzzed quietly, casting a yellow glow across the tiled floor. It was late past visiting hours, but the cardiac wing allowed for exceptions. Nurses moved like shadows, soft-soled shoes barely making a sound. Graham stood at the edge of the corridor, bouquet in hand, suddenly unsure. Claire didn't notice him at first. She sat slouched forward, elbows resting on her knees, her fingers tangled in her hair. Her coat was draped over her lap like a blanket. A vending machine hummed beside her, and across from her, a framed print of a waterfall did its best to feel comforting. He could have turned around, left the flowers with the nurse, walked out as quietly as he'd come, but he didn't. Instead, he took a step, then another. The flowers were simple white tulips, her mother's favorite. Claire had mentioned it once, absent-mindedly, while arranging a desk calendar. He remembered. When she finally looked up, her eyes met his without surprise. Only exhaustion. She didn't speak, neither did he. He sat beside her, careful not to brush against her coat. The plastic seat creaked beneath his weight. He placed the flowers gently on the chair between them. Claire stared at them for a long moment. "She's asleep," she said finally, her voice dry, barely above a whisper. He nodded. Claire didn't look at him. They say she's stable, but they always say that before telling you she's not. Graham glanced at the closed double doors ahead. Room 302. The monitors inside blinked steadily, their soft rhythm muffled through the walls. He cleared his throat. "I didn't know where else to go." Claire gave a small, humorless laugh. "That makes two of us." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was gentle, tired. They sat like that for a while, not touching, not explaining, just breathing in sync with the quiet machines and their own uncertainty. Graham looked down at his hands, the fingers that once shaped marble, that signed deals, that gripped too many steering wheels and too many nights. "My mother died in a hospital like this," he said quietly. Claire turned, slightly, not enough to face him fully, but enough to listen. "I was in a meeting," he continued, "some presentation in Midtown about asset portfolios. She'd been ill, but not critically. Or at least, I didn't think so." He paused, swallowed. "They called twice. I ignored the first one, took the second because the room went on break. By the time I arrived, she was already gone. The hum of the hallway filled the space between them." "I didn't cry," he added, softer now. "Not then, not later." Claire didn't respond. She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. "But when I saw you tonight," he said, turning slightly toward her, "sitting here, looking like the whole world had taken from you and hadn't said sorry." He stopped. Something in his throat closed. Claire didn't move, but her breathing changed. A little sharper, a little slower. He let the silence come again, let it stretch without panic. Then she said, "I didn't leave because of the job." He waited. "I left because I couldn't stand the way you looked at me in that room, like you'd already accepted it. All of it. Like the cost didn't matter." He exhaled, long and quiet. "I thought I was protecting something bigger," he said, "but I forgot that people don't live inside quarterly reports." Claire finally looked at him fully. Her face was pale from lack of sleep, eyes rimmed with red, but her gaze was steady. "You didn't forget," she said. "You just stopped letting it matter." Her words landed without accusation, just truth. He nodded once. She looked down at the bouquet, lifted it carefully, turned it in her hands. These were her favorite. She murmured, "I remember." The lights flickered softly overhead, timed by some unseen rhythm. A nurse passed them, nodded, and kept walking. Then, without speaking, Claire shifted, slowly, quietly. She leaned against him, not fully, not in surrender, just enough to let her shoulder rest against his. He didn't move. He just let her be there. No apology, no expectation. Her head tilted, gently, until it found his shoulder. The weight was light, familiar. He closed his eyes. It wasn't affection, not yet. It was understanding. Two people carrying things too heavy for one. And in that moment, beneath flickering hospital lights and the hum of distant monitors, neither of them needed anything more. The clay was stubborn that day. Like it knew he wasn't ready to shape anything honest until he remembered the curve of her smile. The studio felt different now. It had been nearly a week since the night at the hospital. Claire hadn't called, she hadn't written. But that moment, the weight of her head gently resting on his shoulder, had followed Graham like a soft echo he couldn't shake. So, he returned to this place, to the dust and the quiet, to the cracked windows that let the wind sneak in and the scent of pine sap from the woods nearby. The light was pale and forgiving. The tools sat where he left them. The sculpture of the child and the faceless father still stood in the corner, watching silently. But today, Graham didn't look at them. Instead, he moved to a new table. He cleared it slowly, deliberately, brushing away bits of plaster with his sleeve. Then he took a block of untouched clay from the shelf, a heavy, cool mass, and set it in the center. He didn't know what he would make, only that he had to begin. At first, his hands forgot the rhythm. He pressed too hard. The clay resisted, cracked at the edges. He tried again, softer, more deliberate. He didn't reach for tools, only his fingers, thumbs smoothing along the ridges, palms curving into the clay's cold flesh, coaxing rather than commanding. No plans, no sketches, just memory, not even of her face, but of a feeling. That soft tilt of her head when she listened, the faint wrinkle between her brows when she challenged him, the way her mouth softened almost against her will when she watched someone being kind. He didn't try to capture Claire. That would have been dishonest. What emerged beneath his hands was a woman, yes, but undefined. No exact features, not even hair, just expression. The beginning of one. He worked through the night. Time slipped between breaths and the rhythm of pressure and release. He forgot to eat. Forgot the ache in his lower back. Only noticed the blood when it seeped from his thumb. He'd nicked it on a wire loop tool hours ago. He wrapped it loosely, kept going. When morning broke, it found him sitting on the floor. Clay streaked across his jeans, the beginnings of a jawline resting in his lap. Not yet smooth. Not yet right. He didn't speak to anyone that day, didn't check email, just returned at dusk, lit the single bulb hanging over the center table, and began again. By the third day, the bust had taken shape. The shoulders were slight, the neck slender, but strong. The mouth was tilted not in a smile exactly, but in the moment before one, that breath between hesitation and laughter. He ruined it 5 times. Each time, he scraped it away with the dull side of a wooden spatula. Each time, he started again. Not because it wasn't good enough, but because it wasn't true. On the 6th attempt, he let it be crooked, slightly off-center, as if the woman in the clay had just heard something unexpected and hadn't decided yet whether to be amused or angry. It reminded him of Claire, but not entirely. More like the version of her he'd never had the courage to see. The eyes were hardest. He avoided them for days, left them blank, smooth, like unopened doors. He told himself he was saving them for last. But the truth was simpler. He was afraid. Afraid of what he'd see. Afraid he'd get them wrong. Afraid he'd recognize in their depth what he'd spent years pretending didn't matter. On the 5th night, he finally gave in. He sat in silence, holding a damp cloth in one hand. fingers trembling with fatigue and something else he wouldn't name. He began with the left eye, small strokes, gentle pressure, letting the lids emerge before the shape, letting light and shadow guide the curve, then the right. As he worked, a memory returned uninvited. Claire, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, handing him an umbrella after he barked at an intern for being late. She didn't say anything, just looked at him, long enough for him to feel it. He hadn't looked back, not then, now. His hands moved as if remembering for the first time. When the sculpture's eyes finally took form, he stepped back, just a few feet, and looked, not at the clay, but at himself, what he'd ignored, what he'd missed, what he'd allowed himself to become. It wasn't the sculpture that broke him, it was the eyes, soft, searching, disappointed, maybe, but not closed, not yet. Graham sat on the stool, hands covered in drying clay, and wept. No gasping, no shaking, just tears, quiet and sure, like rain finding its way home. He stayed in the studio 3 more days, sleeping on a worn cot near the back wall, heating instant soup in the microwave someone had left behind years ago, letting himself forget the company, the buildings, the board. And for the first time, he didn't feel like he was abandoning anything. He felt like he was arriving. The sculpture wasn't finished. He knew it would never be. But that didn't matter. It had done what it needed to. It had let him say things his mouth could not. It had given shape to what guilt had blurred. It had returned to him the only part of himself he'd missed, the one who still felt. On the 7th day, he stood beside the bust, wiped his hands with a rag, and whispered, "It's time." He wasn't sure what came next, but he knew where he had to go. And for once, he didn't feel like he was too late. The boardroom was full again. Suits, screens, silence. But this time, the silence wasn't from fear, it was from waiting. Waiting to see what Caldwell would choose to become. Graham stood at the head of the table, just as he had a dozen times before. The same polished floor reflected the same leather shoes. The walls still held their framed accolades, market expansions, skyline dominations, quarterly wins. But today, they didn't impress him. He no longer saw legacy in those frames. He saw noise that had, for too long, drowned out voices that truly mattered. The proposal had stalled. Technically, the asset sale had yet to be finalized. A few investors grew hesitant after public backlash trickled in. The media picked up whispers layoffs, internal unrest, and executives' mysterious departure. Still, the majority of the board was ready to move forward. That morning, Graham asked to reconvene. Some assumed it would be damage control. Instead, he brought a folder. Inside it were only 3 pages, and a letter. "I want to revisit the restructuring vote," Graham began, his voice calm but resolute. Chairs shifted, murmurs stirred. The CFO frowned. "We've already committed our position." "No," Graham looked directly at her. "We've drafted intentions. We haven't executed them." Mr. Granger, the eldest board member, cleared his throat. "What is this about?" Graham took a breath. Let it settle. "It's about who we're becoming," he said, "and whether that future includes the people who helped us build this company in the first place." The room fell still. He continued, "I want to withdraw the proposal to liquidate our legacy divisions. I want to reallocate capital to preserve jobs, especially those of employees who've been with us over a decade. I'm also proposing a new retention fund to protect tenured staff during future transitions." The CFO blinked. "That's not fiscally?" "It is," he interrupted. "If we stop treating people like line items and start treating them like the foundation they are." There was a pause, a long one. Then, Mr. Granger leaned forward. "You're asking us to abandon a deal worth $87 million based on sentiment." Graham didn't flinch. "I'm asking you to redefine value." The pushback came quickly. "What about shareholder expectations? What precedent does this set? What if we lose investor confidence?" Each objection landed with practiced rhythm. These were people trained to see risk before humanity. trained, as he once was, to ask how much before why. But Graham didn't raise his voice. He let them speak, let them vent, let them worry. Then, when the noise quieted again, he pulled out the letter. "May I read something?" They looked at each other. No one objected. He unfolded the paper. The edges were creased, worn. His voice softened, not out of weakness but out of reverence. "Dear Claire, I heard what happened in the meeting. I won't pretend I wasn't scared, hell. I've got 2 grandkids and a bad knee. But watching you stand up to all of them like that, I remembered why I stayed at Caldwell all these years. It was never the buildings. It was the people. I don't know what happens next, but I wanted to thank you for reminding me of that. With respect, Marvin Ellis Facilities, 31 years. Silence followed. Graham looked up. His voice steadied. "I found this in her desk drawer. She never gave it to me, never mentioned it, but she kept it." He paused. Claire didn't build towers or secure capital, but she built trust, loyalty, dignity. He stepped forward, voice deepening. "I built buildings," he said, "but she built people." He let the words hang, and then added, softer, almost a whisper, "I finally learned which one matters more." No one spoke. For a moment, it felt like the air itself was deciding what to do. Then something surprising happened. The youngest board member, a woman who had barely spoken in prior meetings, lifted her hands and began to clap. Once, then again, slow, measured. A second joined her, then a third, and then it wasn't silence anymore. It wasn't noise either. It was acknowledgement. They didn't call it a victory. Graham didn't want one. But the motion passed. The sale was canceled. The fund approved. And in the corner of the room, beside a half-full water pitcher, sat Claire's paperweight shaped like a quill. He'd brought it that morning, quietly, intentionally. He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. The office had a second coffee cup on the desk now. No one asked. Everyone noticed. It was the same kind of ceramic mug as before, simple, navy blue, the rim slightly chipped. But where it sat told the story. Not on the visitor side of the desk, not hidden behind a stack of files. It sat beside the first cup, like it had always belonged. Claire's return to Caldwell wasn't accompanied by a press release or an internal memo full of buzzwords. There was no standing ovation in the lobby, no bouquet at her desk, just quiet eyes from those who remembered, and respectful nods from those who had hoped she'd come back. She walked through the 42nd floor with measured calm. No fear, no anger, just presence. Her nameplate now read, Claire Donovan Director, Human-Centered Communications. The title felt oddly right, not because it sounded impressive, but because it described something real, and she was done pretending otherwise. Her new office had the same view she'd admired for years, but from a different angle. The lake still shimmered in the morning. Traffic still crawled below, like thoughts trying to form. There were fresh folders on her desk, handwritten notes from the people she used to work beside. But what caught her attention was the folded slip of paper left on top of her notebook. It wasn't formal, it wasn't typed. It was Graham's handwriting. Stay. Not because you forgive me, but because you believe in what we're building. She didn't smile, not fully, but she did sit down and pour herself a cup of coffee. Lydia, her former assistant, popped her head in around 10. Her eyes widened and then softened. "You kept the paperweight," she said. Claire glanced at the small quill-shaped object beside her laptop. She nodded. "It's heavier than it looks." Lydia bit her lip, then added, "We've missed you." Claire didn't reply, but her hand briefly touched Lydia's as she handed her a file. Sometimes, that's enough. They didn't talk about what happened that day. Not right away. Graham hadn't called since the night at the hospital. No text, no flowers, only the letter to the boardroom. And now this quiet invitation. It was better that way. Words only mean something when they come after silence. Around noon, he knocked once on the frame of her door. No fanfare. He stood in a charcoal gray coat, no tie, hands in pockets. Lunch. She tilted her head. Where? He said the name of the diner she used to disappear to on bad days. The one with chipped counters, too many ketchup bottles, and the best grilled cheese north of Madison. She paused, then rose to grab her coat. They walked there. The sidewalks were damp from last night's rain. Pigeons scattered near bus stops. Claire's boots clicked steadily. Her steps matched to his without trying. Inside the diner, nothing had changed. The same waiter David raised his eyebrows when he saw her. "You're back." She nodded, sort of. David poured their coffee without being asked. Graham didn't speak until Claire had stirred in her cream. 2 turns, no sugar. "I came here," he said quietly, 3 times after you left. She looked up. He met her eyes. "I'd order your usual, sit in your booth, and wait, just in case." Claire looked down at her mug. The steam curled upward like a question. Why she asked? "I think I hoped," he replied, "that if you saw me sitting here unchanged, you might believe something in me had." She didn't answer right away. Then she reached for her sandwich, took a bite, chewed slowly, swallowed, 3 times. "Huh." He nodded. She raised an eyebrow. "That's it." He almost smiled. "First time I didn't know if I wanted you to come back," he admitted. "Second time I hoped you would. Third time, I realized I couldn't force it either way." Claire wiped her hands on a napkin, eyes still on the table. Did it help? The third time? Yes. The server came and went, refilling water. Claire looked out the window, where 2 kids were chasing each other with paper bags on their heads. Then she looked back at him. "Do you believe in what we're building?" His reply was immediate. "I do now." She picked up her cup again, held it in both hands. The diner hummed softly around them, muffled conversation, clinks of silverware, a distant bell over the door. Claire didn't make grand declarations. She just nodded once, looked him in the eye, and said, "Okay, let's build people." They stood in front of the sculpture. She hadn't seen it until now. He hadn't spoken about it, and yet everything she needed to hear was there. The air inside the studio was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt sacred, not the absence of sound, but the presence of stillness. Claire stepped through the doorway slowly, her boots pressing softly against the concrete floor. Outside, late afternoon light cast long slivers of gold across the walls. Inside, the smell of dust, clay, and faint traces of pine hung in the air. Graham had called that morning, not with an agenda, not with news, just 5 words. "Come to the studio today." She said yes without asking why. Now, standing there. She knew the reason. The sculpture wasn't covered. It stood in the center of the room, bathed in soft, natural light. Not on a pedestal, just directly on the worn wood platform where he'd always worked. Claire's breath caught as she stepped closer. It wasn't a portrait, not exactly. The figure was feminine, yes, but abstract. The curves were human, but not literal. The jawline was soft but incomplete, the shoulders slightly turned as if mid-thought. One hand rested near the collarbone, open, not grasping. The eyes were the most striking, not looking forward, not looking down, just open, as if listening. Claire didn't speak. She just stared. Graham watched from a few steps behind, arms folded loosely. No explanation offered. He knew she'd understand. After a long silence, she said, barely above a whisper, "It's not me." "No," he said quietly, "it isn't." She turned slightly toward him. "But it feels like something I've never been allowed to be." He nodded once. "That's because," he said, "this is what I never knew how to say." She didn't move. Didn't need to. The light shifted slightly, brushing across the sculpture's cheek, casting a thin shadow beneath the chin. Claire stepped closer. "I don't even know what I'm feeling," she said, her voice shaking. Graham stayed where he was. "You don't have to." She reached out not to touch the clay, but to let her hand hover near it, like she might disturb something sacred if she got too close. "It's the first time," she whispered. "Someone didn't try to fix me, just saw me." A silence grew between them, full, deep. Then, a single tear slid down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away, neither did he. Graham walked toward her, slowly, until they stood side by side. "She's not finished," he said. "I don't think she ever will be." Claire glanced up at him. "That's why I kept the eyes open," he added. "It's the only part I didn't touch again." Claire blinked, then gave a soft laugh, half breath, half ache. "You were always afraid of eyes. I still am. But you made them anyway." He nodded. "I had to." Another silence, but it wasn't empty. They sat on the bench against the back wall, near the shelf of old tools and hardened brushes. No words passed between them for several minutes. The light in the studio dimmed slightly as the sun dipped behind the trees outside. Graham leaned back against the wall, his head tilted toward the ceiling. Claire sat forward, elbows on her knees, hands clasped. "I didn't cry at my divorce," she said suddenly. He turned to her. "I didn't cry when I lost the grant," she continued. "Didn't cry when they told me Mom would never fully recover. But today," she looked over at the sculpture. "I feel undone, but not broken." Graham didn't respond. "Just waited, I think," she added. "I needed someone to let me fall apart." "Not so I could fix you," he said. She looked at him. "So you could sit with me in the pieces?" He nodded. They didn't talk about the future. Not about titles or roles or definitions. There was no, "What are we now?" No, "Where do we go from here?" There was just the studio, the quiet, and a sculpture that would never be complete. That was enough. That was everything. Later, as they prepared to leave, Claire stood once more before the clay figure. She traced the line of light with her eyes, noting the imperfections intentional, unpolished, true. Graham reached for his coat, but stopped short of putting it on. "You'll keep working on her?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, I think she's finished in the only way that matters." Claire smiled, not wide, not bright, but honest. She walked toward the door, paused, then turned. "I still don't forgive everything," she said. "I don't expect you to, but I believe in what we're building." He didn't answer, just nodded, once, slow. She opened the door. Before stepping out, she said softly, without turning back, "Thank you for saying it without saying it." The door closed gently behind her. Inside, Graham stood alone with the sculpture, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone at all. Sometimes, the most powerful transformation begins not with grand gestures, but with the quiet courage to speak the truth, especially when it's uncomfortable. Claire didn't plan to change anyone. She simply refused to keep hiding her voice. And in doing so, she awakened something long buried, not just in her boss, but in herself. This story reminds us that healing doesn't always come wrapped in romance or resolution. It comes through being seen, being heard, and learning to sit with our own broken pieces without shame. We often underestimate the impact of presence of simply being there for someone, not to fix them, but to remind them they're not alone. You don't need a title to lead. You don't need permission to matter. And even if life has hardened you, it's never too late to return to the part of yourself that still feels. So, whether you're 35 or 75, maybe today, is the day you stop apologizing for your heart and let it speak. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. If it touched your heart, made you reflect, or simply reminded you of something true, you're not alone. We believe stories have the power to heal, to connect, and to light the way forward. If this story meant something to you, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. It helps us bring more heartfelt stories to those who need them most. From our heart to yours, thank you for being here.